Good morning, everybody. It's so good to see all of you and have an opportunity to spend time with you worshiping God. Now, we've been looking for a while at different things as far as entitled Jesus and Me. Now, as we're looking at it today, it's all going to be focused in Matthew. So if you have your Bible, you might want to go ahead and turn to Matthew. And it's going to be focused on Jesus speaks, the different things that he said. Now, if I was to go off of everything he said, well, it talks about the things he said and the things he did. There weren't enough books to contain everything. But if I just went off the things he said here in Matthew, we'd be here a while. And so we're going to look at 5 different areas about Jesus speaking. You know, I remember growing up, and you remember these different commercials. For some reason, there's some commercials you just remember more than others. Bounty, the quicker picker upper, right? And so you see some of the different ones, but also when E.F. Hutton talks, people listen, all right? And I know that eventually that the demise of that company and now it's being reused in another area, but that I remember those commercials, as soon as they'd say when E.F. Hutton talks, you'd hear everybody they'd be leaning in to whoever was talking about E.F. Hutton. Well, I know it doesn't work that way in the classroom. Those of you that have been in the classroom. Because the teacher walks in, and when the teacher's talking, it just doesn't happen. And usually the first thing, or one of the few things that the teacher's going to say at the very beginning is going to be, okay, listen up, everybody. Or, okay, listen. Or, I need your attention. Hey, be quiet, I've got something to say. Or, this is really important. All those different things are said. You know, when we're looking at, we just turn on the radio, there's a lot of things that want your attention. There's a lot of advice that's given. It seems like everybody's an expert. Everybody has information to share and advice to give. But when Jesus talks, everyone should be listening. It shouldn't be like an E.F. Hutton. I mean, they're out of business. Not everybody was listening. And what is the difference when Jesus talks? Do we listen or do we make exception to it? There's some people that make exception. You know, when and I know that I've heard of a lot of married couples that say this, that, well, my spouse has selective hearing because when I'm talking about this, they're not listening. But all of a sudden I mention something different, then all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, I'll take that. You know, in other words, you know, I need some help in the kitchen. Nothing. And then, hey, do you want steak for dinner? Yep, that sounds good. Yep, that'll work. I mean, so you listen when you want to listen. And it's with a lot of people. We just kind of tune in. And sometimes we do the same thing with Jesus. We kind of tune in. There's certain things we're like, yep, that's exactly right. I've been talking about that a lot. And in this lesson, you know, and in other lessons, sometimes you come up and you're like, man, so-and-so should have been here. Man, this was the lesson for them. Or you're looking around in the auditorium while someone's saying something that you think is really important that they need to pay attention because they're having the problem with it, and you're looking over at them, making sure are they listening? I hope they're listening because that's them. They struggle with this. I don't, but they do. Or, you know, you're hitting your spouse beside that. Hey, you paying attention to that? He's talking about you. You know, either way, it's all about listening. But we make exception. So if it's about me, I don't think so. But if it's about you, then yes, you need to listen up. Well, Jesus talks a little bit differently. He talks to everybody. And in Matthew chapter 4, starting in verse 18, we've mentioned some of these before as they just keep coming up because there's so much in these. This is another one that we've talked about before. It says, while they're walking on the Sea of Galilee in 18, it says, he, talking about Jesus, saw 2 brothers, Simon, who's called Peter, and Andrew, his brother. They're casting nets for their fishermen. And he goes up to him and he says, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. It says in verse 20, they left everything. They left their nets and they followed. They left their business and they followed him. They left their way of getting money and getting income and they followed him. It mentions the same thing in chapter 9. The very beginning of chapter 9, it talks about when Matthew was called. Chapter 9, verse 9, it says, when he passed there, a man called Matthew sitting in a tax booth, and he said, follow me. And he leaves his job and he follows. He leaves all those responsibilities to take on the greatest responsibility, to follow Jesus. And so point number one is he speaks to challenge. When he speaks, he is challenging us. Are we going to step up and are we going to rise up to the occasion? I've seen a lot of different groups when in thinking of sports here, and when they're faced with a challenge, there's two different options. You either raise up and you meet that challenge head on, or you fall back and you lose the competition. And here we are in life. Either we're going to rise up and we're going to meet the competition, that would be Satan, or we're just going to fall back and we're going to fail. When he says, follow me, are we going to raise up and follow him? Man, when he says, you got the Son of God, there was nothing made that wasn't made without him. He was there from the very beginning of time. You're created in his image. And he says, a special invitation, come follow me. That's a sense of belonging. When he speaks, he is inviting you to be with him. I've had a lot of invitations, and I know you have too. And there's some invitations you're just like, man, I wish they hadn't given me this invitation. I don't want to go to this. Man, surely there's something else that I've got to do instead of going to this. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation where you've been invited to something and someone's already said yes on your behalf and you didn't have a chance to say no. And it's probably your spouse. Said, yes, we'd love to come. And then your spouse is like, I didn't really want to go to that. I just wanted to stay home and just relax this weekend. I'm just so busy. Just wanted to relax here and do nothing. And next thing you know, you're having to go. But this is not that type of invitation. This is an invitation that says, I want to be in your life and I want you to be in my life. I want to live with you forever. And this is the Son of God. God the Son. There, the sustainer of everything that you see is saying, I want to be in your life. Man, that's belonging. That should challenge us enough. When he speaks, it should challenge us enough to say yes. There's no invitation that's going to be greater than that. As you go on in Matthew chapter 4, in verse 23, he says, and we went to Galilee teaching in the synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction of the people. And so his fame spread throughout all Syria. And they brought to him all the sick and afflicted of various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, epileptics, paralytics, and he healed them. And the great crowds followed him all the way. I mean, everywhere he goes, it talks about all the places they followed. And then it says in chapter 5, verse 1, and seeing the crowds, he went up to a mountain and he sat down. And disciples came to him. And there he speaks to clarify. When he talks, when other people talk, it can be very confusing. When he speaks, he's clarifying things. For instance, he says in verse 21, chapter 5, he says, you've heard it said, it was of those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. Well, let me clarify in verse 22. But I say to you, anyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. Verse 27, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. Clarification, verse 28, but I tell you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery in his heart. Verse 31, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give a certificate of divorce. Clarification, verse 32, but I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality, that's talking about adultery, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Verse 33, again, you've heard it said of those of old, you shall not swear falsely, nor shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I tell you, do not take your oath at all, neither by heaven or on its throne or the throne of God. Or by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is a footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is a city of the King David. And simply, let me clarify, in verse 37, let your yes be yes, and your no be no. In verse 38, you've heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Clarification, verse 39, but I tell you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if one slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him your other also. Verse 43, you've heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Clarification, verse 44, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So he gives clarification. When we sit there and we listen to all these people, whether it be our friends, people in the community, people on TV, radio, any type of media outlet that we have, they start talking about things and it gets really confusing. Jesus, when he speaks, he's clarifying. He said, you may have heard these things, but I'm telling you that's not the case. This is the case right here. And so he's telling you these things so you can have a better life. He's trying to clarify so you don't live in a confusion because he's not the author of confusion. So he says these things because he's invested in them. He says these things because he's invested in you. He wants you to belong to him. He's inviting you. He's wanting you to be invested in him because he is invested in you. And now look at Matthew 9. So in Matthew 9, they bring this paralytic. He's lying on a bed. And Jesus, it says he saw their faith. And he said to the paralytic, take heart, my son, your sins are forgiven. Now, they know only God can forgive sins. And so behold, in verse 3, behold, some scribes said to themselves, this man is blaspheming. Because after all, only God can forgive sins. He forgave sins, therefore he is saying he is God. Well, you bet he's God in the flesh. But they don't believe that. And so Jesus said, knowing their thoughts, he said, why do you think evil in your hearts? Which is easier for you to say, your sins are forgiven, or to rise and walk? But so you know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Rise, pick up your bed, and go home. So all of a sudden, this man is healed. It started off, though, because he speaks to cleanse. Point number 3, he speaks to cleanse. He forgave this man's sins. And if I had a choice of being healthy or having my sins forgiven, I'm choosing my sins forgiven every day. 7 times a day, 7 days of the week, every day, every time I get that opportunity, I'm going to say, forgive my sins. Because I don't have to walk to go to heaven. I don't have to be healthy, have this healthy body to go to heaven. I don't have to be a sound mind to go to heaven, but I have to have my sins forgiven. So forgive my sins. What an amazing thing. He's forgiven his sins. It's a clean slate. And the amazing thing is he canceled it. He cleared it. There's no more debt there. But these people are aggravated. And so he said, well, I just want you to know that I didn't just say it, but I can actually do it. I'm going to cause this man to do something he wanted as well. I'm going to let him walk, and he's going to be able to walk home now instead of being carried home. He does something that we can't do for ourselves. He cleanses us. It's something that we can't do for ourselves. I've known people who've done some horrific things, or horrific things have happened to them, and they feel guilty. And a lot of times it's interesting. People go in and they take a shower to remove the filth off of them, thinking that the filth is going to come off. The sin that they've done is going to come off in a shower. But they do that, and I think they know that there's only one way to get that done. It's through baptism you get forgiveness. And it's God working while you're being baptized. But here, we try to do things ourselves, and this is something we can't do ourselves. We can't get forgiveness of ourselves. We can't remove it. We just keep remembering it, don't we? That's why 1 John chapter 3, 19 and 20 is in the Bible that talks about God's greater than your heart. And he knows what you're going through. And when he forgives you, he forgets it, as it talks about in Hebrews 8. So he is able to do something you can't do. He forgives and he forgets. you're forgiven and you remember. And he's telling you, man, I can do something you can't do. When I speak, I cleanse. When I speak, I clarify. When I speak, I challenge. And the whole point is, if he's greater than your heart, and he knows when your heart's condemning you, it says he's greater than your heart, are you listening? Are you listening when he says, come follow me? Because he's given us that invitation too. Are you listening? When he clarifies this scripture, the only way we know that he clarifies is if we're reading it. That's the only way we get a chance to listen to him. Are you listening? Go to chapter 12. Chapter 12. In chapter 12, in verse 46, it says, while he was speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside asking to speak to him. Now, when I'm around someone who has their family, I know where I rank. I know I'm going to be second because they got their family. Their family just showed up. And they're going to want to talk to their family, spend time with their family. You know, it happens like if a family comes up and wants to see where one of the new staff workers that I work with work, the family comes up and wants to kind of look at the place. And so I know that, hey, I need to give them some time to talk and visit and catch up. So I do. Well, this Jesus' family, his mother and his brothers are outside and they're asking to speak to Jesus. And he replies to the man that told him this information. He said, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And he stretched out towards his disciples. So I imagine he just stretched out and he says these. Here are my mother and here are my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. And so all of a sudden, point number 4, he commends. He speaks to commend. He is encouraging them. He says, if you're a disciple, you're my family. And you know there's certain people in your life that say you're like family. You know, they say, oh man, you're like my mother. You know, you're like my other mother. You're like my dad. You're like my other dad. You're like a brother to me. You're like a sister to me. That's not what he's saying. He's saying you are family. You're not like family. You are family. We have a place. Not did he just sit there and say, hey, I want you to come follow me. I'm asking you to be a part of my life and for me to be a part of your life. Not only is he clarifying things so there's no confusion. Not only is he cleansing and wiping out the slate, something you can't do for yourself, but then he says, man, you're not like my family. You are my family. If you're following me, you're my family. And there's nothing more important. You know the old saying that blood is thicker than water? No, he's saying water is thicker than blood. He's saying you're my family. If you do my will, you're all about me. And you're going to spend life with me forever. He's talking about acceptance. He's talking about belonging. And then go to Matthew 23. In Matthew 23, he starts talking. And when this is a very, very pointed chapter that we'll spend time diving in a little bit later on at some other point. But in 23, he speaks to condemn. That's point number 5. He speaks to condemn. He's going to talk about their false sense of righteousness. He's going to talk about their false sense of ministry. He's going to talk about their false sense of greatness, what they think is great. And we're just going to look in verse 13. It says, but woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. In other words, he's saying, and he's condemning them, he's saying you're picking winners and losers. You're going in and you're inspecting the soil instead of planting and watering. That's all your job is to do, is plant and water. But you're inspecting, and these people aren't worthy of hearing the gospel. These people are. These people are worthy to be disciples, and these people aren't. And so they're picking winners and losers. He said, that's not how we do this. You throw it out to everybody and see who follows. In verse 14, he goes on, he starts talking about people that are taking advantage of the helpless. Looking on, and it says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses. for a pretense to make long prayers. Therefore, you receive a greater condemnation. You're taking advantage of those that are helpless. He's condemning them. Look in verse 15. It says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel across the sea and land to make a single proselyte. That means a person that's following the old law. It says, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. He said, so you go to all these sacrifices, do all these things to convert somebody, and then you just beat them down to where they have no hope of salvation. They make it to where they feel like they can't be saved whatsoever. And he's saying, he condemns that. He's saying, I'm telling you, if you're beating people down spiritually, if you're picking winners and losers, if you're taking advantage of the helpless, I'm condemning you right now. And he goes on in verse 16. He says, woe to you, blind guides! You say, anyone who swears by the temple, it is nothing, but anyone who swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound with an oath. So he's talking about how some people, their oath, well, if you say an oath here, then it's more important than over here. Earlier we read, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Simple, that's it. You just say it and that should be good enough. But for them, the short-sighted and their value in things that God never really meant to say, you don't need to have a value. Well, if I say, you've heard, well, I swear to you on my mama's grave. Man, you don't have anything to one way or the other, any power of life and death. How are you swearing by someone else's grave? How are you swearing by the temple? How are you swearing by the gold in the temple? How are you swearing by anything? Because you didn't make anything. You have no power of anything. You just simply say yes and no. And what their mouth is writing checks their body can't cash. That's what he's doing. You're saying something and you have no power to say it. He's condemning them. And then look in verse 23. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You who tithe mint and dill and cumin, and then neglect the weightier matters of the law, like justice, mercy, faithfulness. These you should have done without neglecting the others. And so they got the wrong focus. There's no compassion. And another way of saying it, they're majoring in the minors. They're focusing on these one things. In other words, it's kind of like me saying, it's so important to come here to worship on a Sunday morning, which it is. But I don't ever talk about the fact that we're supposed to be worshiping while we're here. That we're supposed to be saying prayers, that we're supposed to be offering these prayers along with the person that's praying. That we're supposed to be taking the Lord's Supper and remembering Him. That we're supposed to be reading these scriptures and seeing how it applies to us. That we're supposed to be singing songs of praise. I don't worry about that. I just need you in a pew. That's missing the minor for the major. We're supposed to be here, but we're supposed to be here for a purpose of an audience of one. Then he goes on in verse 25. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside are full of greed and self-indulgence. In other words, you've got a defiled heart. You're corrupt inside. He condemns them. He says, you're worried about this outside. Haven't you known these people? And they just look so great on the outside. Look like they're put together. They got all these clothes and they got makeup. I'm not saying I wear makeup, but some people, they've got all the makeup, their hair, all this stuff. I'm talking about ladies now. And then the guys, they've got the latest style and they got all these different things. They got the belt and the shoes and all these different things. Like that really matters. We focus on that. And inside, man, they haven't worried about cleaning on the inside. They're clean on the outside, but they don't think about the inside. It doesn't matter the clothes that you wear if you're modest. Am I right? That's exactly right. We get focused in this jacket. We get focused in these kind of things. This jacket doesn't matter. These outside things, these are just trappings that get us all bogged in to say who's more important. Those things don't matter. God says what really matters is what's on the inside. Now, you need to be modest and not being immodest in your dress. But if you're modest, the outside doesn't matter. He condemns them. And in verse 29, he goes on and says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and decorative monuments of the righteous, saying, if we lived in these days of our fathers, we have not taken part in the shedding of the blood of the prophets. But yet they're not listening to the prophets today. They're not listening to Jesus. And so he condemns them. They're just playing church instead of being the church. And that's a thing we can get wrapped up into when we're acting like we're coming here and we're self-righteous, when we realize, man, there's some things we need to start working on. There's some things we need to start doing. We need to not be in the same place next year. We need to have grown. So he condemns them. And the whole point, when he speaks, man, we should be listening. And so the question I have for you is, are you listening? And how can you tell that you're listening? How can anyone else out there in the community and here inside this building tell that you're listening? How do you prove that? How do you show that you're listening? It should be shown by the way you live your life. It should be shown by the things that are coming out of your mouth. It should be shown by the essence that you realize Jesus is living in you. And so because of that, you exude excitement. When difficulties come, you know Jesus is going to show his power. You know that when you pray that he's going to listen to you. You know that you've got the confidence that where you're going to go in the end. And when someone says to you something, you're able to answer in kindness, not in viciousness. You're able to be that way. And you think about, there's a lot of different things, a lot of conflict going on. But how are you going to be different? How are you listening to Christ? You know, we can sit there and sometimes we can partially listen to Jesus. I listen to the good times, the good things that he says. I listen to those things. Those things that are easy for me to obey. There's some that are easier than others. I listen to those things. You know, and these other things, they really apply to other people. I'm just going to stay in my lane, and this is where I'm going. I'm not going to grow anymore. I'm not going to become more like Jesus every day. This is it right here. And I'm looking at that, and if we partially listen, and we don't think it applies to us, but it applies to everybody else, think about what happens. Think about what happens to you as an employee or as an employer, as a student, as a spouse, as a parent, as a father, as a mother, as a son or a daughter. If it doesn't apply to you, then you're making up your own rules. And he's still speaking. The most important thing that was ever said is in Matthew chapter 17, verse 4. So if you have notes, I would write Matthew chapter 17, verse 4. Nothing more important said than that verse right there. In Luke chapter 6, as you're turning there, Luke chapter 6, verse 46 through 49, and verse 49 says, if we don't listen, we're going to collapse. In John chapter 12, verse 48, it says, if we don't listen, we're going to be condemned. In Acts chapter 3, verse 23, it says, if we don't listen, we're going to be cut off. So we're going to be collapsed, we're going to be condemned, and we're going to be cut off from the Lord. We cannot make it if we don't listen to him. And there's only one way to listen to him, and that's to get into his word. In Romans chapter 10, verse 17, it says, we get faith from listening to his words. This whole New Testament is full of his words. And so Matthew chapter 17, verse 4, you have one commandment. Listen to my son. He speaks. He's still speaking. And what a blessing that we have his words. Listen to his son. Listen to my son is what he says. But we need to listen to his son. We need to listen to Jesus. We need to wake up every day. And I've challenged you, as you wake up, if you wake up tomorrow. If you wake up tomorrow, that means God is still patient with you. And if you wake up tomorrow, look in the mirror as you're getting ready and answer the question, are you going to listen to Jesus? And I hope it's a resounding yes. Because if so, your life will change forevermore. And you'll never be the same. You want to see some people that change? You start looking through this New Testament of people that interacted with Jesus in the gospel. And you see their response and how they lived afterwards. What happened to them after they had that encounter with Jesus? And then you see those people in Acts. After Jesus already ascended, you see those people in Acts. Once they encounter the words of Jesus and they listen to him, how their life changes forever. All throughout the New Testament. Won't you be that person whose life changes forever? If we can pray for you, if you need to study about what salvation is, let us know what we can do. But don't hesitate. Please listen as we stand and sing.